All right, students, welcome to Chapter 14, the Civil War. So this is going to be our last unit for the rest of this year, and then next year when you guys come back and see me in 8th grade, we're going to talk about Reconstruction, but we're going to end here on one of the most explosive moments in American history. So this is going to be some exciting, great stuff that we're going to learn about, some major battles, brothers against brothers, fathers against sons, sons against fathers. We're going to learn quite a bit here about the Civil War. So a few things first off. Make sure that you read the stream, look at the assignment. We're not going to be doing quiz assignments throughout this unit. Instead, I have simply assigned you the study guide. And you can do the study guide at your own pace, and it will be due on the 20th. That means on the 20th, you need to have it fully filled out, turned into me, and it's going to be worth 50 points. So make sure that you are working on it continuously. Not all, it's not going to be 5 questions per section that I'm going to cover here. This is going to kind of be various here and there, depending on what we're covering that day. So some of these units are going to be really short and some of them are going to be really long. So just make sure you're working on your study guide on your own pace. I have included the map, and I have also included your textbook, and I have provided the study guide itself in the assignment sheet. So make sure you are working on those continuously. All right. So what we are going to do today, though, is we are going to start back in and show you how we really get to the Civil War starting off. I know we've had a long process getting here, but we're going to discuss it just a little bit more, and then pretty soon we're going to be talking about stuff blowing up and people getting shot. So we're getting to that point, all right? All right, so let's just jump right into this. One of the things, if you guys remember, when we looked at politics of this era, we were looking at polarization of politics. You have groups in the North and groups in the South, and they're no longer able to compromise and find solutions in order to keep together politically, economically, and socially. So this becomes a splitting factor when you come looking at the United States right up to the 1960s, and then the fracture does occur. What was creating these frictions? If you guys remember us discussing these, we have the fugitive slave laws, which the North completely opposed in many cases, but the South demanded it in order to protect their slaves and their right to be able to go and get them again. You also saw the growth of the abolitionist movements. In fact, you see the growth of the Republican Party, which is pretty much an abolitionist party at this point. They're anti-slave, but more so their focus is no more slavery in the Western territories or any new American territories. So they are still, though, an anti-slave party, though, and they're seen as a direct threat to the Southern institution of slavery. The second thing that happens here is that Congress's hands are now tied in order to find compromises in order to alleviate these polarization issues between North and South. And that, of course, occurs because you have popular sovereignty, which means states now get to decide on their own. No longer does the Mason-Dixon line or the Missouri Compromise start to come into play anymore. Those types of compromises are dead. You have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you also have Dred Scott, which is one of the most inflammatory Supreme Court decisions in history, if not the most. It just depends on your viewpoint, but historically, many of us think it's probably one of the worst decisions ever made, which basically legalized slavery throughout the United States, which many Northerners opposed and wanted to fight. And this is why it becomes a political issue, because specifically of Dred Scott. And then the last thing that happens when we are looking at the pushes towards war is the division of political parties. The Whigs basically have fallen apart. They're dead. The Republicans have risen, and they're the anti-slave party. They also have a few other platforms. And then you have the Democratic Party, which breaks apart in the run-up to the election of 1860. It literally splits in half from North and South. So you see a fracturing of political parties and the rise of new political parties that really create issues that push the nation further, closer and closer to war and further apart. With this, you have, in 1860, the Republicans. And the Republicans themselves, yes, they are anti-slave. But the other thing is they are promoting is other ideals, too, that are opposed by Southern Democrats. And first one is, of course, and we've really gone over this a few times, but it's always good to hammer home this point. The Republicans, again, were looking to raise protective tariffs to protect industries in the North. They also wanted to continue opening up land in the West and the Midwest and West, providing free land at times and also land grants that they can use for money too that could raise funds for the federal government itself. So they were fine with trying to push westward expansion, and that also included running a rail line from the Pacific to the Atlantic and vice versa. They wanted to have full-fledged Western expansionism, and that's why they had that very anti-slavery element, because they really wanted to develop the West. And if they were going to develop the West and the South had its way, then there was a good chance that you would have a number of newer slave states being added to the United States, which they did not want. So that's, again, key point to their platform: no further slavery into the new territories. We're not going to have it. And so they were very firm on this position. They were going, hey, South, you know what? Keep your slaves where you're at. Just don't let them go anywhere else. We don't want it spreading throughout the rest of the country. If you guys want to have slaves down in your little section of the country, have slaves down in your own little section of the country. Do not impose that upon the rest of the country. So the Republicans were very unwilling to yield that position when it comes to the election of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln becomes president. That's one of the direct reasons why the South leaves, is because they want to be able to still have a say onto what new territories and state have access to slavery. The South itself, they see this as a pivotal moment. Either they get a Democrat in there who can then ensure that they shift enough of the federal government to their side so that they could get a constitutional protection of slavery. If they could do that, then they could stay part of the Union. If a Republican wins, then they're out. They're done. There is no chance for them to be able to secure future political victories that would allow them to enshrine slavery into the Constitution of the United States. Now, admittedly, when you look at it and you look at the compromises, the Republican Party, again, right after the election of Lincoln, they make a proposition to put slavery into the Constitution, but again, they wanted to limit it to just the southern states that had it currently. They refused to allow any more new slave states. That became one of the conditions, and again, objectionable enough to the South that the South desired to leave. So, what basically happens is Lincoln wins. He wins the election of 1860 because the South, the Democratic Party breaks between the North and the South. And the Northern Democrats, they put up Stephen Douglas, and he is not going to support the Southern's views of slavery. And the Southern Democrats put in their own candidate, and so basically the Democrats split the vote, allowing Lincoln to take the victory via electoral college victory. He only secures about 39% of the popular vote because everything else is broken up among those other groups. And so Lincoln goes in with a strong electoral college mandate, but he goes in with a very weak, considered quote-unquote weak, popular mandate. So he takes over, but at this point, that is such an objectionable view from the South, especially South Carolina, that they decide that they are just done and they're out. They're not going to be part of the United States anymore. They take their toys and they go home, basically. And so they leave, and they secede from the Union before Lincoln is even sworn in. Just after he wins the election, that was enough for South Carolina to look at it and say, no, we're not even going to try here. We're going to leave. So Lincoln, even before he's sworn in, though, he sat there and he tried to make compromises. He sat back and he said, what can we do to try and bring the South back to the Union and make sure that they're happy? And he told them point blank, all right, we'll strengthen and we'll improve and we'll enforce the fugitive slave laws. The federal government will help you out. Federal government will back it. Federal government will help pay for parts of it. And the South wasn't convinced. The South again comes to that table again where they're looking at and they're saying, we want slavery further west. And the Republicans say, look, we're willing to put it in the Constitution. We're willing to protect the institution constitutionally, but we're not letting it spread. And the South says, we want it to spread. We want it to go more places. In fact, we want to even try to take over Cuba and put slaves in there. In fact, if you read about it, there's sections that you can, portions of U.S. history you can read where there was Confederate dissidents before they were Confederates who actually went down to areas in Central America and tried to overthrow governments to institute more slave-holding countries. So, expansion of slavery was definitely a true Confederate ideology where they wanted it to continue to expand. They did not want limitations. If there was limitations placed on it, they said no, we're not gonna take those. Either you allow slavery everywhere or we leave. That's basically their position throughout this entire time. So what happens in then February 1861, you then see Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas all leave the United States. And they decide, you know what, let's start talking about forming a country. Now, as I always mention him as being the worst president ever, James Buchanan, what does he do? Well, he does nothing. He sits there and goes, what you're doing is illegal, and then does nothing about it. In fact, he does less than nothing. He does so bad of a job that his Secretary of War starts to send guns to the South and to the Southern armories, even though they had, quote-unquote, left the Union. So not only was he terrible at stopping secession, he was terrible allowing his Southern Secretary of War to arm the South in preparation for a war with the North. So this is another reason why I could truly believe that James Buchanan is probably the worst president in the history of the United States, plain and simply. He's just bad. All right. What these 7 states initially do that are the Confederate states of the of America, they get together and they create a compact and they start to draft a constitution. What it does is it takes them a whole whopping 3 days, unlike when we learned about the U.S. Constitution. And mainly that comes from the fact that they took a lot of the United States Constitution and made a few shifts and changes here and there and said, oh, here's our Constitution. One of the things, though, it does is it decentralizes. Well, okay, let me be clear on this. It was supposed to decentralize federal power, and it was supposed to give the states greater power. Remember that old line from the Articles of Confederation? States were supposed to be the ones that were allowed to impose tariffs and taxes. Nothing could be done on the federal level unless it was passed with 2/3 majority rules. And then the other thing it does, the Southern Constitution, it truly protects and enshrines slavery into their Constitution, where it basically says that if you're part of the South, you cannot pass any laws to ban slavery. Slavery is the bread and butter of our republic down here. And if you don't believe so, you can read numerous writings about people when they come out of the South and when they are looking at it. The most famous is from the Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, who is from Georgia, says, our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal of the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. So as you can see, when somebody tries to say to you that the South was not founded upon slavery, the Vice President of the Confederate States of America makes it very, very clear that it is founded upon slavery. Now, let's talk about something here really quickly, okay? Let me finish talking about the government first off. One of the things is that it was supposed to create a Supreme Court. They never set one up because there was no checks and balances of power. Eventually, Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States of America, he basically can run the nation as almost a pseudo-dictator, which he kind of does throughout the war. Because there's, again, like I said, there's no checks and balances system in place because the Supreme Court never exists in the South. And the states basically give him a lot of power and ability to try to run the war effort. Now, let me go back when we talk about the foundation of the Confederate States of America. You're going to hear the argument out there. If you study history long enough, or if you get exposed to history, or if you even go to the South, you will hear that the South left the United States because of states' rights, that they had the right as the state and the revolutionary principles that the federal government was violating the rights of a state, so a state had the right to leave the United States and secede and create its own country or form a new confederation. So people always say it was a states' rights issue. Now I'm going to quote our other 8th grade history teacher, Miss Purvette, and she will always say to you, if you ask her why, and she'll say, well, people say it's a state rights issue, or you can say to her, well, it's a state rights issue, and she'll look at you and go, right to do what? Right to do what? And it's the right to keep slaves, right to keep servants, right to keep people in bondage. There is, in the United States, it's a very fascinating look at the Civil War, of how it's written throughout history. At the end, you have what people frequently will talk about, the Southern Apologist movement, about how it's seen as a justified war. It's done because they were trying to protect themselves. People who fought in the war were fighting to defend their states from the unconstitutional government actions of Abraham Lincoln. They tried to demonize Lincoln and his war powers. You're going to see people who try to defend the South's position because history was written for one of the very first times by the people who lost the war. And people allowed that revisionist history to last for a very long time. The evolution of how the Civil War is studied has changed from right after the end of the war into the 1900s, changes again in the 1920s, shifts again in the 1950s and 60s, changes in the 70s and 80s, and it's still constantly evolving even in this time frame of how we look at the root causes of the war and why the war happens. One thing, though, you can always guarantee, if you study the Civil War properly and you study it under the proper conditions and you go in with the proper mindset, is you will find in the end that the Civil War was pushed by rich elitist planters who wanted to preserve the system of slavery. The system of slavery probably would have naturally died out in another 20 years in the United States. It just would have gone away, just would have fallen apart. It was not economically viable for it to continue on. Eventually, international pressure would have been placed so heavily on the United States that it would have been forced to abandon the idea of slavery, and therefore, if they did not, there would be economic sanctions, which would again bankrupted the southern plantations. Great Britain was already heavily enforcing and removing slavery throughout the world, and the British Empire was the most powerful empire on earth. So if they were opposing it and they were putting it down, they would have eventually come down on cotton growers in the South and said, we're not going to trade with you anymore. End slavery. And it would have eventually just ended. However, you have this group of elitist planners down there who are trying to protect what they consider and call their property, which was a great measure of their wealth. The South fought the Civil War to preserve slavery. That was it. Now, when you look at the average soldier fighting in the Civil War, so you look at little Johnny Reb, who's running around out there, he was sold a bill of goods that they're defending his state against Union intrusion. That is what he's taught. That's what he's told. That's why if you were to go read young Johnny Reb's journal, and if he survives the war, he's going to have throughout his journal, those darn Federals, they came and invaded my family's farm and started killing people. I had to take up arms to go and force those Federals out of my state. He's not sitting there writing about, and this is where people say, look at the writings, look at the journals. He's not sitting there writing going, I had to defend my family's plantation against these Federals who were trying to take my family's property. He's not going to write that because he doesn't have any slaves. He's been sold that he's there to defend his home and his state against federal intrusion, instead of it being told properly how a group of rich elitist planters really pushed for the idea of seceding from the Union in order to protect their plantations and their economy and their economic system. Understand this. If you want to debate the merits on me, you better come with some pretty strong backing and factual evidence to prove me otherwise. But I can tell you for a fact right now, I've done my research too, okay? All right. So we're going to end here this time. I know I've talked really long on this, and this is only a few slides, but I find it is very important to discuss this. Make sure you work on that study guide, and I will see you guys again tomorrow.